hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. November is over, guys. December is here. Deck your halls, light your menorah, get ready for New Year's, whatever you got going on. This is like the holiday season for a lot of people. You know, it's kind of a weird holiday season for me just because of where I'm at in my personal life with my family stuff, but I am excited to sort of embrace the hopefulness and spirit of this season. And November was actually, I think, a lot better reading month for me in terms of having stronger reactions to the books that I had. So like, I'm feeling like I'm on a good kind of wave going into December. I do have some housekeeping notes about December for you guys, so I'll put that at the end of the video. But anyway, sticking with November, it was, I think, a pretty positive reading month in the sense that I didn't have a lot of meh books. I had a lot of books that I either loved or hated, and so we will get into that. But anyway, before we talk about specific books, let me tell you about some of the stats I had, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so in terms of the total number of books I read, I had 22 this month, which is pretty average, I would say, for me. Lower than it's been in the last few months just because I read bigger books this month, which we will get to because I'm going to tell you about how I did with Nonfiction November and Tome Topple. Because of those challenges and just generally what I was in the mood to read, they were somewhat longer books and therefore I didn't read quite as many as I have in some months past. But as you can see, I did pretty good. Had 14 books that I read off of my TBR and then 8 that I got from the library. And then in terms of the breakdown of the format, I had a few audiobooks, not as many as normal for some reason, not sure why that was. I had 6 physical and then as normal, mostly ebook. In terms of my day-to-day reading, guys, a lot of what I do is on e-reader, even though what you see are physical books. I tend to read more on my e-reader. I don't know why that is, but anyway, that's just my personal habits. And then a good mix of genre. I will say that I read a lot more mystery and fantasy this month than I normally do, so maybe that was part of why I had more extreme reactions to things, was that I was either really liking or really not liking some of the books that I was reading in those genres. My typical, I had some nonfiction, hence Nonfiction November, which we'll talk about, some memoir, some lit fic, some romance, some historical fiction, and that was about it. So not as much of a variety this month, actually, in terms of my actual genres. I do normally read a little bit more variety, but, you know, still, I think, pretty omnivoracious, all things considered. And then a pretty average number of total pages, coming up on 8,000. And like I mentioned, I was reading longer books, so typically my average page count per book is closer to 300, but this month it was closer to 360, so there you go. I was reading slightly longer books. Pretty new books, average-wise overall, about 3 years old on average, and I've been doing better the last couple months of reading books when they're coming in. So some of that is because when I read library books, obviously they don't stay on my TBR for very long, but also I think I did a better job of reading new books that I got in kind of immediately this month, so only 2.5 months average length of time on my TBR. And then getting into what I was alluding to earlier, that I had extreme reactions, my average rating was right there in the middle at 3.05 stars. And you can see from this distribution, I did have several things that I really liked, but I also had several things that I really did not like. And actually, I forgot to even include a couple of DNFs I had. So I guess that would theoretically bring that average down even further. But yeah, you can see that I didn't have a lot of things that were sort of in the middle. I tended to have things I was either liking or not liking. And some of that is due to the challenges that I did this month. So let's go ahead and transition into talking about what those challenges were. So I think what was driving some of my extreme reactions were that I did do 3 challenges this month, one of which I started in October, but I definitely finished in November. So I did my lowest rated books on my Goodreads TBR challenge. So you saw the videos, the vlogs and stuff related to that. So that definitely drove some of the lower end books. I also did Tome Topple and I did Nonfiction November. So let's start with Nonfiction November. I read 2 books for that, one of which was one of my hits for the month. So I read Not That Bad by Roxane Gay, which I have been slowly working on since May, but it's a lot. But I did finally finish it up, and I would definitely recommend this. I will say that, so it says it's dispatches from rape culture, and it definitely is that. I personally wish there had been a few more essays in terms of the ratio. I wish that a few more of the essays had been tilted more towards the rape culture piece of this rather than sexual assault or sexual violence itself. There is a lot of people sharing their personal stories of sexual assault and violence, which I think it's really important that people share those stories. I'm not trying to say that they weren't good. I just think that what I thought I was being sold was more about the whole idea of not that bad, that the problem with rape culture is not just actual physical violence, but that our entire culture is set up in a way to allow, in particular, women to be sexualized and made to feel like any kind of objection that they have to that sexualization and that objectification, and being seen as essentially just at the disposal of men for their sexual pleasure, that they're feeling that that is not okay, is constantly minimized and constantly say, oh, it's not that bad. That women who get catcalled on the street, well, he didn't actually assault you, so it's not that bad. I wish there had been a higher ratio of essays more along those lines. That being said, I don't think that there's a bad essay in this bunch. I think that they're all really powerful and very hard to get through subsequently, but I really appreciate everybody's, the sharing that happens in this book. I will say that probably my favorite essay in this is the one that's about sexual assault and violence against immigrants. That is just like kind of a fact of immigration. At this point, I think that especially in light of some of the debates that we were having in the US, at least around immigration, but also in Europe around people coming from the Middle East and whatnot, I think that that's a really important conversation to have, and I was really startled by the statistics that the author of that essay shares in that. So I thought that was really, really good. And then I also, in terms of the ones that were less kind of non-fiction-y type essays and more just like personal memoir essays, I really like, there was one about the luckiest MILF in Brooklyn, I think was what it was called. I really like that one a lot. So anyway, definitely would recommend. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, so I ended up giving this a 4-star, but this was definitely really good. The other book that I wanted to make sure I got to was We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I talked more about this in my What I'm Reading Right Now video in the middle of the month, so I'll mostly just refer you to that. I will just say that this was definitely a hit for me this month. This was another 4-star, but it was a better 4-star than not that bad, if that makes sense. But I definitely did enjoy this. I definitely felt like this was a hit. So both of the ones that I had planned to read for Nonfiction November were definitely great. But I will tell you that my favorite thing I read for Nonfiction November was not in my planned TBR, but I did get it out from the library this month, so I listened to it. It was an audiobook called White Fragility by Robb and Diangelo. Now, I listened to this book after I made my Is BookTube Racist video, and basically this person was saying in a much more eloquent way what I was trying to get out in that video, which is just a lot about how to talk about racism specifically with white people and this idea of white fragility, which is that because we're taught that racist equal evil people, it makes it very difficult for white people to be honest with the fact that we are all just like indoctrinated to be racist against, specifically in the US at least, Black people, but really anybody who's not white, and how it makes it very difficult to have a non-defensive conversation with white people about that. So it was written by somebody who specifically does education around kind of how to help white people be less defensive about that, and it was just really well done. I think my comment on Goodreads about this was, if I'm ever in the position for like a work book group to pick a book about diversity, this is 100% what I would pick, because I think she does a great job of sort of like being the bridge and translating for white people why their own fragility is holding back the change in conversations that need to happen about race. Anyway, it was really excellently done. If you liked that video I did and agreed with what I was talking about in it, this says it much better than I did. If you didn't like that video and you thought I was being dumb, if you want to read a more persuasive argument version of what I was saying, I definitely would recommend that book. It's not very long, and I think it's just like super important. So I gave that 4.5 stars. That was actually my favorite book I read this month. 2 other hits before we move on to surprises that I had this month. One I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up, which was Visions in Death by J.D. Robb. It was just another really good entry in the In Death series, and I think had a lot to say about, like, there was a lot of really good character development in it, and I think that in that video I was talking about how I really respect how that particular series handles a history of sexual assault and showing a heroine who is both profoundly changed by it in both good and bad ways, that it has made her the strong person that she is, but that she also, constantly has to overcome new things because it was so wounding and damaging to her. So anyway, I just think that it's in that respect in that book, the character development was particularly strong. I read 2 other ones in the series that I didn't like as much this month, but that one I thought was really, really good, so it was definitely a hit. And then I read Red's Sister by Mark Lawrence, which I was telling you guys in my mid-month wrap-up that I just really was enjoying it and that it was one of my favorite immersive fantasies that I've read so far this year. That definitely sticks. Now, I do think that it had essentially just like some pacing issues with the plot and some kind of weird choices with the plot that I didn't think were necessarily bad, but just weren't my favorite. So I'm excited. I already bought the sequel, which is Grey Sister. I don't think that I'll get to read that this year, but I'm planning on maybe reading that in January or February. So I'm excited to see where it goes from here. I think that it's just a super interesting world. So if you haven't heard, I heard about this from BookTube, which is why I ended up picking it up. So you very well may have heard about Red Sister already by Mark Lawrence. But what I really liked about it is that it has a lot of sort of like catnip tropes in it. So it is a magical boarding school. It is a kick-ass, but actually in this case, genuinely kick-ass heroine, like female protagonist. It has really cool, like a really cool magic system, and it has a really cool world that's sort of like post-apocalyptic fantasy is what I would call it. So I haven't read the N.K. Jemisin Broken Earth trilogy yet, but like from what I can tell, I think it's in that same sort of vein that it is a fantasy world, but it also has a heavy dose of like post-apocalyptic to it. I also thought what was really interesting, and I didn't realize it until I was pretty far into the book, it is a fantasy novel that has very few men in it and therefore avoids a lot of the misogynistic bullshit that I sometimes don't like in fantasy novels that are written by men, just like candidly, like that sometimes holds me back from really liking some of the, especially older fantasy books. But he does a great job of managing a cast that is like almost all children and women, which are 2 things that I think can be a pitfall for people to write well, just to be honest. But I think he does a really nice job with the characters. I like that there are different types of girls in it, and I like that he avoids a not like other girls kind of trope in this, because like our main character Nona is definitely like a fucking badass, but like she's not like other girls, because most of the girls in the schools are all fucking badass. Like they all like, and the teachers are all like warriors, or half of them are anyway. It's dealing with a lot of catnip tropes, like I was saying, and I do think that it manages to do fun, inventive things with those tropes. I think the idea of taking this magical boarding school and then putting it in a religious convent with warrior nuns is just like a super cool play on several different, like it's combining tropes basically, I think, in an interesting way. And yeah, I'm super excited to see what happens next. He also manages to do something that I usually don't like in books very much, like it's rare for me to get on board with this, which is he manages dual timelines, I think, in an interesting way. Like I could guess what some of the future flash forward things were, like I didn't think it was that surprising, but I still thought that he judiciously sprinkled them in a way that was constructive to the plot narrative and not distracting from it. Just super good immersive fantasy that really worked for me. And in a month where I had some real problems with fantasy, which we will get to, I was really excited to have one that I was very like into and thought was excellent and would definitely recommend. Okay, a couple of surprises, and then we'll get into my disappointments, which is where I think the meat of this video will be. So first of all, surprise was the first volume of Monstress, which I read this month. I actually have the next 2, so I will be finishing that up probably either in December or January. I really like this. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I will say that the reason I put this as a surprise is that I had always heard that this was, I mean, it's written by 2 women. I'd heard that this was very female positive. I will say that the art style of this I found somewhat off-putting, because I felt like it was still very sexualizing and felt male gazy. And I think by the end of it, I understand why they were doing that, but I did find that surprising. And frankly, I think I said this in my mid-month checkpoint. That is what keeps me from reading a lot of graphic novels, is I just don't like that art style. Like the kind of typical manga art style of how women are drawn, just straight up, it bothers me is what it comes down to. But I mean, it also has like these Art Nouveau elements to it that just make the artwork really beautiful. And I think the further we got into it, the more I was okay with it, because I felt like it was a choice and not just a default, if that makes sense. So anyway, in that sense, it was a surprise. And I was also expecting to absolutely just adore this. And while I did really like it, and by the end was very excited, I'm excited to continue in the series. I do think this had some pacing problems that I hadn't really heard people talk about. So just FYI, I do think the first third of this is weird in terms of its pacing. And I think it really takes the first like third you have to kind of get through to get to the point point where this is really kind of finding its stride. So anyway, surprising, like I said, 4 stars, so did really enjoy, but just not quite what I was expecting. Another surprise, again, I'd mostly talked about this in my mid-month wrap-up, so I won't go on too long, was Little White Lies by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. The only reason I said this was a surprise is that I was surprised I didn't love it as much as I wanted to, because it's Jennifer Lynn Barnes who wrote like one of my all-time favorite YA series, which is The Naturals, and I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. It's really well written and I really like the characters. I just wasn't that into the tropes that this was playing with, so I think my takeaway is, as much as I love Jennifer Lynn Barnes, for me to love her particular book, I also have to really like the tropes. Now that being said, she has a new series or a new book that's coming out in May that has tropes that sound like they are much more up my alley, so I'm excited for that. Okay, and now we come to the disappointments. So all of the disappointments were in some way correlated to a challenge that I did this month. So let's start with my one that is maybe not surprising that they were disappointments given what the challenge was, and that was my lowest rated books on my Goodreads TBR challenge. So what I did was basically I picked the 5 lowest rated books on my Goodreads TBR list, my Goodreads want to read list. So I kind of did a sort and figured out what those 5 were that had a reasonable number of reviews. I didn't want to just pick one that only had 5 reviews or something. And I read them. My biggest takeaway from that was that if a genre book has a low rating, believe it and don't read it. That was sort of my takeaway. And the way I came to that conclusion was primarily through the 2 most disappointing ones that I read this month. These are like the worst books I read this month, bar none. The first one being Death at Breakfast by Beth Gutcheon. This is like kind of a cozy mystery that's just like one of the most boring books that I've ever made myself get through. It was commercial fiction. It was a commercial fiction mystery that I was bored in, and like the entire point of commercial fiction is to entertain. So like, if you're not having a good time, what the actual like, move on. So if I hadn't been doing this challenge, I would have DNF'd this, but I kept going. So I ended up giving it a 1.5 star. It was not good. And then I also read my least favorite book of the year, another one I would have DNF'd if I had not been doing this challenge, which was Winter at Death's Hotel by Kenneth Cameron. It was rage-inducing. Just go, you watch the vlogs, watch the wrap up, and you can get my full download on how terrible this book is. But like, highlights are aggressive misogyny dripping from every page, non-beautiful prose, which is a part of what I expect from historical fiction, and a mystery that was utterly unsatisfying. Oh, and also just an ending that made no sense. Queer baiting, bury your gays, ruining a historic figure for you, never will think about Arthur Conan Doyle the same way. Just all the problems with this particular book. I really didn't like it. It's my least favorite thing I've read so far this year, so it was definitely a disappointment. But like I said, you can check those 2 videos out if you want to see like my full thoughts. And then the 2 books I read for Tome Topple. Now originally I planned to read Stiletto and The Gutcheon by Tana French, which I have not yet read, sadly, but hopefully I'll get to that here in the next week or 2. But I did actually end up reading A Gathering of Shadows, which also is more than 500 pages, so it ended up qualifying. So these were my 2 books. Let's start with the one that made me least mad, and that's Stiletto. So I ended up giving Stiletto 3 stars. This is not a bad book. It's just that it was a sequel to one of my all-time favorite books, which is The Rook. The Rook by Daniel O'Malley is such a good book, and for me, like, if you want to know, like, me as a reader, I feel like that is one of the books I would tell you to read to understand me, because it has so many elements that I like in terms of, like, playing with tropes, playing with different genres, bringing them in, a level of disorientation of not quite knowing what's happening, but, like, it being on purpose and the author walking you through it, there being a mystery plot, but also a fantasy world, there being, like, strong characters, just all the things. And this book tries to recreate some of that, and it just is messier. Like, that's a good word. This book is just kind of messy. Everything that's happening in this book, like on a page-to-page level, is interesting. It just doesn't come together in a satisfying enough way. And I think part of my problem is that I loved reading, our main character in The Rook is Mfanwe Thomas. I think that's how you say her name. And I just loved her in that book. Like, she was one of my favorite parts of that book, that character. And I was expecting, especially from the back of the cover, from the description, I thought she was still going to be the main character in this book, and she's not. She's one of the characters, but really it's following these 2 new women who I really like both of them. It's Odette and Felicity, who are the main characters in this. I really like, and I think they're still good characters. It, again, messy is a good word because I like them, but I'm not as invested based on what the expectation the back cover kind of set up for me and what happened in the first book. I didn't realize I wasn't going to be spending as much time with Mfanwe, and I didn't realize I was going to be spending so much time with Odette and Felicity. I think that this suggests interesting things that could happen in a subsequent book. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to stop reading this series or anything. Like that's not the problem. It's more just that I had really high expectations of what this might be. And even when I tried to temper them, I still ended up being somewhat disappointed. And for, you know, I think this is like almost a 600-page book. Like, you kind of want to be super into it the whole time, and I just wasn't. So anyway, this wasn't terrible. Like I said, this is a 3-star book, and I would please read The Rook by Daniel O'Malley. It is so good, and it works as a standalone. You don't have to continue if you don't want to, and I will continue in the series, but I think I now know, like, oh, really The Rook is what I'm always going to love, and then the subsequent ones are only going to be sort of like, if I get to them, it's fine, sort of a thing. I think I don't know how much I'm going to end up editing this, but like, I literally just ranted about A Gathering of Shadows for like a smooth 10 minutes. So maybe I'm going to pull that out because that is a really long bit of ranting. You know what? I just made an executive decision. I just filmed a 8-minute rant about this book because it was a disappointing book. However, I don't know that everybody wants to sit through that in this video. So I'm going to post that rant at the same time I post this wrap up as a separate video in case you don't want to have to sit through almost 10 minutes of me ranting about this. TLDR, this book had so much promise, and I am so infuriated that poor editing kept this from being a book that worked in its own right or as a book that works in the overall series and the overall story that's being told in this series. It should have been much better than it is, and that really disappoints me. I ended up giving this 2.5 stars. It's not the worst thing I've read. The series isn't the worst thing I've read, and there's so many parts of this that I really like, but I am ultimately really, really disappointed in how this ultimately turned out. And yeah, definitely probably my most disappointing book of the month because I hated Winter at Death's Hotel, but like I didn't have a lot of high expectations going into it, whereas I did have really high expectations going into this and they were somewhat thwarted. Whew, okay. I've been talking for a long time, so I think it's time I wrap things up. I do have some housekeeping items. Part the first, I have a 2,000 subscriber giveaway up right now. Side note, I just checked, I gained 400 subscribers in the month of November, which is insane considering that like I think I'm at like 22 or 2,300. Like that's a huge percentage of my subscribers that I gained in this month. So like, don't know where you all came from, but appreciate you, excited that you're here, and it still blows my mind that people give any kind of a shit about what I have to say about books, but there you go. If you want to enter that giveaway, I think it will be running until the 14th of December, so go check that out. Second thing is, second and third, I have some programming notes about what we're going to be doing in December. So what I did last year, which I liked and want to do again this year, is that I'm effectively making December 15th the end of the reading year for me. So I am going to be doing my best and worst lists for the year starting at the end of December because I just really like doing them at the end of the actual year. A lot of best and worst lists of the year have already come out in the bookish online world, and I don't know, I just am not super strict about the calendar year part. I know some people are, so I'm cutting off at December 15th. So I will be having a lot of lists up for you guys, and that is because by the end of the year I will have read like more than 250 books, so picking just like the top 10 I think it's just too difficult. So I did a poll and people overwhelmingly were like, girl, bring on the list. We love them. It's fine. You do you. So I'm going to be doing that. So basically just telling you to buckle up because I'm going to have a lot of wrap up lists and like favorite and worst of the year type things. So there's that. That was my second programming note. And my third programming note is that I'm also going to have a Sunday series running from like the end of December to early January that I think I'm going to call New Year, New You, because why not? And basically just on topics that kind of come up at the end of the year when people are making resolutions. So like I had some things I wanted to share about BookTube, like some questions and answers about BookTube. I have some things about bookish bullet journaling and some things about keto. So those will be coming out on Sundays towards the end of this month and the beginning of next month, but they won't get in their way of my normally scheduled programming. So if you don't want to watch them, they won't like take away from the content that I would normally make, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure you guys knew. It is now almost dark out, so it's probably time for me to go. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. Let me know what some of your hits, surprises, disappointments for November were, what you were reading. Love to hear that. And I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having a really lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!